What if I told you that the greatest threat in the Wild West did not come from loaded revolvers or sharp arrows? The most terrifying and ruthless enemy crept up on settlers silently, without making a sound. It could destroy even the strongest and best-armed detachment in a matter of weeks, leaving only a ringing silence behind. This enemy was invisible but palpable hunger, which forced people to look at the world they knew with completely different eyes. The history of the American frontier is not just a heroic chronicle of shootouts, chases, and gold rushes. It is an endless, exhausting saga of the search for calories in the vast and often hostile wilderness. Here, every bite of food was the result of hard work or incredible luck. Pioneers, trappers, and gold prospectors set off into the unknown, with only hope and meager supplies in their saddlebags. Their supplies dwindled at an alarming rate, forcing people to perform miracles of ingenuity. They had to literally create culinary masterpieces on the fly, from what modern man would consider garbage. They used boiled bones, internal fat, wild roots, and even leather equipment. This struggle for food changed people's psychology, turning them into tough pragmatists. Survival depended not on marksmanship, but on the ability to preserve a piece of meat in the summer heat. Women in covered wagons learned to cook lunch from nothing, keeping their families strong. Men in the mountains forgot the taste of bread for months on end, dreaming only of a simple hot soup. It was an era when cooking became the most important skill for self-preservation. Watch the video to the end to find out how ordinary vinegar essence replaced fresh fruit for farmers and how an army survived on a dish that resembled concrete. Want to know a secret that will change your perception of healthy eating in the past? Long before the advent of modern sports supplements, the inhabitants of the plains created the perfect product for survival. It did not spoil for decades and contained a tremendous amount of energy in a small volume. We are talking about pemmican, a unique concentrate that became the fuel for the entire fur trade in North America. It was not just food, but the most important strategic resource of the time. Real conflicts broke out between trading companies over control of pemmican supplies. Without it, it was impossible to organize long expeditions deep into the continent. Pemmican allowed people to travel light without depending on luck in hunting. The process of making this product was a long and laborious ritual. First, the harvested bison or deer meat was cut into thin, almost transparent strips. These pieces were laid out in the sun or hung over the smoke of a fire. The meat had to dry until it became brittle, losing all its moisture. Then these wood-hard layers of meat had to be ground up. They were placed on flat stones and ground into a fine powder with other stones. This work required enormous patience and physical strength. The result was a substance resembling coarse meat flour. The next step was to prepare the binding agent. The animal's internal fat was melted in cauldrons until it became liquid. The boiling fat was mixed with the meat powder in a 1-to-1 ratio. The result was a thick, dense, and very high-calorie mass. Sometimes dried berries were added to the mixture to improve the taste. Most often, bird cherry, cranberry, or erga berries were used. The berries added a little vitamin content and a slight sourness to the product. However, the classic recipe often did without these extras. The finished product was packed into sewn leather bags. The mass was tightly packed to remove all air and prevent oxidation. Another layer of fat was poured on top for complete airtightness. In this form, pemmican could be stored for years, withstanding any heat or frost. This product was absolutely indispensable for trappers and travelers. Just one handful provided an adult man with energy for a whole day of hard work. It could be eaten dry on the go, without dismounting from a horse. This was critically important during a chase or covert movement. Pemmican was often used as a base for hot dishes. It was boiled with water and a small amount of flour to make a thick soup called robo. This dish could warm and satisfy a person in the most severe blizzard. The body received a powerful surge of strength almost immediately after eating. Pemmican was purchased by the ton, providing caravans with provisions for months ahead. This invention of the indigenous peoples proved so perfect that the technologies of the civilized world could not offer anything better for a long time. It had a specific taste, but in conditions of hunger, no one complained. Could you eat only dried meat with fat for a whole month? Write about it in the comments and be sure to subscribe to the channel. Are you ready to learn the truth about who gold miners valued more than their partners? In the harsh conditions of the Klondike and California, a prospector's most faithful companion was a jar of sourdough starter. This living organism was the only way to get fresh bread far from civilization. Losing sourdough was considered a terrible tragedy, comparable to losing a weapon. Sourdough starter was a fermenting mixture of flour, water, and wild yeast. It required constant care, attention, and feeding with new portions of flour. It was like keeping a pet on which your life depended. Without it, a prospector's diet would have been a dreary assortment of dry foods. On frosty nights, tough bearded men cared for the jar of dough like a child. They took the container into their sleeping bags, warming it with their own body heat. If the starter froze, the yeast would die irretrievably. It was practically impossible to restore the culture in winter conditions. This product was so important that experienced Alaskans began to be called sourdough. This nickname translated as leaven and was a sign of high respect. It symbolized a person's ability to survive and thrive in the extreme conditions of the North. To be a sourdough meant to be a true veteran of the frontier. The famous pancakes were made from this sour, bubbling mass. They were the main breakfast, lunch, and dinner for thousands of people in the mountains. The dough was often kneaded directly in a bag of flour, making a depression. This saved on dishes and time-washing pots. The taste of such bread was characteristically sour and rather coarse. But for people exhausted by monotonous food, it seemed like the most delicious delicacy. Fresh pastries gave the necessary feeling of satiety and comfort. The smell of hot bread reminded them of home and normal life. Sourdough was often passed down from generation to generation as a family heirloom. Some samples traveled along the front lines for decades, outliving their owners. It was believed that the older the culture, the tastier and fluffier the bread would be. Old sourdough starters were valued like gold and were a source of pride. The fermentation process made the grain more digestible for the body. It enriched the meager diet with B vitamins and beneficial bacteria. Thus, intuitive wisdom helped people maintain their health without knowledge of biology. It was a natural prevention of many digestive diseases. Even when industrial dry yeast appeared in stores, many refused to use it. The old-timers preferred the time-tested living substance. For them, it was not just food, but a symbol of independence and self-sufficiency. The connection with the traditions of the pioneers was more important than convenience. Legends about the miraculous properties of old sourdough starters often circulated around the campfire. It was said that they brought good luck in the search for rich gold veins. In a world where chance decided everything, even a piece of dough could become a talisman. Why do you think people are returning to baking sourdough bread in the age of technology? Guess how long it took to create this culinary miracle capable of surviving a nuclear war? We are talking about hardtack, or sea chest biscuits, which were the staple of soldiers' rations. It was a simple but incredibly durable cracker made from flour and water. It was dried to the consistency of a rock to completely eliminate the possibility of spoilage. The hardness of hardtack became legendary and the subject of endless jokes. It was said that these cookies could stop a bullet or be used to shoe a horse. Soldiers often used them as building material for models or stands. It was physically impossible to bite through such a cracker when dry. Eating hardtack required lengthy preparation. It had to be soaked in hot coffee, water, or broth for at least 15 minutes. Attempting to bite off a piece of dry biscuit could result in a broken tooth. In the absence of dentists, this was a serious and dangerous injury. Soldiers gave these biscuits a variety of nicknames, not all of them flattering. They were called tooth crushers, sheet iron, or lockstones. Irony helped them come to terms with the fact that this was their main food for many months. Despite its hardness, hardtack was a reliable source of carbohydrates. Very often, insects infested the wooden boxes of biscuits. Bugs and weevil larvae turned mealtimes into a test of nerves. Experienced eaters simply poured the contents into hot coffee. They waited for the uninvited guests to float to the surface so they could remove them with a spoon. Those who were less squeamish found this a reason for dark humor. They joked that bugs were the only fresh meat in their diet. In the dark, the problem was solved even more simply. They ate without looking. The main principle was to get full at any cost. There was a popular way of cooking hardtack called hell soup. Rusks soaked in water were fried in large quantities of pork fat. This dish was incredibly heavy on the stomach, but very filling. It was excellent for restoring strength after an exhausting march of many kilometers. Migrants in covered wagons bought hundreds of pounds of hardtack before departure. They knew that ordinary flour could become damp or spoil on the road. Rusks, on the other hand, remained unchanged in any weather and humidity. It was a strategic reserve for the most extreme, darkest day. Even years after the wars ended, veterans kept pieces of hardtack. They kept them as souvenirs, and they did not change in appearance over time. It was a symbol of the incredible resilience and deprivation of that era. Hardtack was a reminder of what had to be endured in order to survive. Manufacturers supplied these crackers to the army in huge batches. They could lie in warehouses since previous conflicts, waiting for their moment. Sometimes soldiers were given rations baked 10 years before lunch. Like this if you are glad that today's lunch is not a piece of 10-year-old dry dough. What if I told you that almost everything you believed when looking at an appetizing dessert is not true? In the harsh conditions of the wild frontier, fresh, juicy fruit was an absolutely unattainable and rare luxury that many had not seen in years. The diet consisted of salted meat and beans, but the soul demanded a feast. However, weary housewives performed true miracles of ingenuity to delight their large families with something sweet. Thus, in conditions of total scarcity, the famous vinegar pie was born, which became a true masterpiece of culinary deception. With its taste and delicate texture, this simple dessert was surprisingly reminiscent of an expensive lemon pie. But of course, there were no lemons in it, as citrus fruits were impossible to obtain. The convincing illusion was created by a masterful combination of the simplest and most affordable ingredients that could be found in any cupboard. The thick filling was made from ordinary sugar, chicken eggs, water, and a little wheat flour to give it density. The main and most unexpected secret ingredient was ordinary apple cider vinegar, which was found in every kitchen. It was this ingredient that gave the sweet, cloying filling the necessary fruity tartness that imitated citrus. The addition of strong spices, such as grated nutmeg, completely fooled the eater's taste buds. People would take a bite and be absolutely sure that they were eating an exquisite fruit dessert prepared by a master chef. This pie was often referred to by the people with the rather sad and telling name of Pie of Despair. But for the numerous children of poor farmers, it was the most desirable and delicious treat on the modest holiday table. The ability to cook something delicious from literally nothing was considered the main virtue of a good and thrifty housewife. This culinary magic helped to keep up the family's spirits in the most difficult and hungry times. Another striking example of amazing culinary mimicry was the so-called fake apple pie. It was masterfully made from ordinary cheap saltine crackers, which were soaked in a special sweet syrup. The porous crackers eagerly absorbed the water mixed with cream of tartar and sugar, becoming soft and pliable. After baking, their texture became completely indistinguishable from slices of baked natural apples. Coffee, without which the difficult morning life seemed completely unbearable, was also very often counterfeited by the settlers. Real aromatic beans cost a fortune and were in terrible short supply in remote areas of the country. Heavily roasted wheat, barley, or rye grains were used to give it a dark color. People also collected dandelion roots and even oak acorns, which they dried and ground into a fine brown powder. This strange drink only vaguely resembled real coffee, with its black color and strong bitterness. Naturally, it was completely devoid of caffeine and the invigorating effect that helps you wake up. But the morning ritual of drinking hot, dark liquid warmed the frozen souls of the harsh settlers. People desperately needed the feeling of a normal, civilized life that they had left behind in the big cities. Even from empty corn cobs, people learned to boil down a thick, sweet syrup to replace the scarce sugar. This process was incredibly long, laborious, and required a lot of fuel for the fire. However, the sweet result was well worth the effort. providing the family with a free and affordable sweetener. It was actively used in morning porridge and festive baking instead of expensive imported cane molasses. Even simple tomato juice was sometimes used by housewives to create sweet dessert dishes. It was boiled down for a very long time with a huge amount of sugar and aromatic spices to kill the vegetable taste. The result was a thick red mass, vaguely reminiscent of strawberry jam or berry jam. A desperate desire to experience the forgotten taste of summer made people sincerely believe in this sweet deception. All these strange recipes were not just a primitive way to fill the stomach with cheap calories. It was a touching attempt to preserve human dignity and familiar culture in inhuman conditions. They proved that even in a damp dugout, there is always room for small joys and family celebrations. And what modern dish, in your opinion, would be the most difficult to fake today? Corn became the foundation on which all life on the frontier was built. This grain was cheap and incredibly easy to grow. It yielded abundant harvests even where wheat died from drought. Bags of coarse cornmeal were in every migrant wagon. The most common dish made from it was simple Johnny cakes. These were flatbreads made from flour, water, and salt, fried in a pan. They were quick to prepare, often over an open fire during a rest stop. They served as a universal substitute for bread, a plate, and even a spoon. In the southern regions, so-called hoe cakes were popular. According to legend, they were baked directly on the blade of a hoe heated in the coals of a fire. It was an extremely simple but very filling dish for workers. It was affordable even for the poorest segments of the population. Corn porridge was the daily breakfast for millions of people of that era. It was often served with a small amount of molasses or fat for flavor. It filled the stomach and provided energy for long hours. However, its monotonous taste and sticky texture quickly became tiresome. The exclusive dependence on corn posed a hidden and terrible threat. For a long time, the settlers did not realize the causes of their illnesses. The lack of niacin in unprocessed corn led to the development of pellagra. This serious disease caused weakness, dermatitis, and dementia. The Indians traditionally treated the grains with lime before eating them. This process released the necessary vitamins and made the grains safe. But many white settlers ignored this important step in preparation. As a result, entire families suffered from unexplained weakness. Despite this, corn saved people from starvation more often than other foods. It was used to make literally everything that was needed for life. The stalks were used as feed for livestock, and the leaves were used to stuff mattresses. Even dry cobs served as excellent fuel for stoves. Corn was also the main source of food for livestock in winter. This allowed farmers to keep pigs and horses in conditions of limited pasture. A closed cycle of natural farming was created on a single crop. One grain ensured the survival of both people and their animals. In years of crop failure or locust infestation, the loss of the field was a death sentence. People defended their crops with weapons in their hands against any threats. They understood that their lives in winter depended on these green stalks. The loss of the harvest meant certain starvation for the whole family. Cornbread became a true symbol of American cuisine at that time. It went from being the food of the poor to the nation's favorite side dish. It reminds us of a time when simplicity was the main criterion, and when the availability of food was a matter of life and death. What if I told you that our modern aversion to pure fat is nothing more than a spoiled luxury of affluent times? In the harsh conditions of hard physical labor and constant cold, every calorie was literally worth its weight in gold. People of that era expended enormous amounts of energy just to survive, so pure fat was valued much more highly on the frontier than lean meat cuts. Lean meat was considered the food of the poor, as it did not provide a lasting feeling of satiety. People desperately needed high-calorie fuel to warm their bodies from the inside, just as firewood warms a stove. Without enough fat, the body began to burn its own muscles, leading to rapid exhaustion and death. Fat was the only available energy source capable of sustaining the life of a lumberjack or farmer during the winter. Refusing to eat fatty foods at that time would have been tantamount to suicide. Hardy trappers and lumberjacks working in the taiga could easily drink a whole mug of warm melted lard in one gulp. They often hunted bears before hibernation specifically to obtain a thick layer of subcutaneous fat, which was considered medicinal. Consuming pure fat in such quantities was not considered disgusting or harmful to health, as it is perceived today. People's stomachs had adapted to such heavy food over centuries of evolution. Settler housewives carefully and meticulously collected literally every drop of fat that melted out when frying meat or bacon. It was carefully poured into special tin cans or clay pots, which were kept in the most honorable place by the stove. This accumulated fat was stored like a real treasure, protected from rancidity and mice. Pouring fat into the slop was considered an insane waste, for which neighbors could condemn you. This solidified lard was often spread thickly on bread instead of expensive and rare butter. Butter was usually sold to raise money, and the family ate melted lard. It was added to all morning porridges, soups, and broths to significantly increase the nutritional value of the dishes. Without this addition, food was considered empty and did not provide the strength to work in the fields. The bones of animals killed during hunting or slaughtered domestic animals were never thrown away immediately after cutting up the carcass. They were crushed with heavy hammers and split, then boiled for hours in huge cast iron cauldrons over a fire. The main purpose of this lengthy process was to extract the nutritious bone marrow and fat residues from the depths of the bone tissue. Nothing was to be wasted. The resulting thick and rich broth solidified into a dense jelly as it cooled and was a real concentrate of minerals and proteins. This concoction was often called soup for the poor, but it was excellent for restoring the strength of the sick and elderly. The bone fat that floated to the surface was collected separately and used for special culinary needs. It was a waste-free technology for processing the catch. Animal fat was used for all sorts of things in everyday life, way beyond just cooking. It was rubbed all over rough leather shoes to keep them from getting wet in the snow and mud. Leather soaked in lard became soft, did not stiffen in the cold, and served its owner for many years. It was the only waterproofing available for feet in those days. In addition, pure unsalted fat was used to treat chapped and cracked skin on the hands and face caused by the icy wind. It created a protective film, preventing deep frostbite on the cheeks and nose. It was even used as a technical lubricant for squeaky cart axles, door hinges, and work tools. Fat was a universal remedy for all household problems. In dark dugouts and huts, primitive bowls filled with fat in a rag wick were often lit. These lamps, called fat lamps, gave off a rather dim and uneven light, which was barely enough to work by. When burning, they smoked and spread a specific heavy smell of burnt lard throughout the house. However, this was often the only source of artificial light available during the long winter evenings. High-quality beeswax or paraffin candles were too expensive a luxury, available only to the wealthy or the church. Ordinary people had to put up with the smoke and stench in order not to sit in complete darkness. Fat provided light, albeit imperfect. During long cattle drives, cowboys on the trail cooked their food exclusively on beef fat, which was in abundance. Vegetable oil in glass bottles was rare, unreasonably expensive, and very difficult to transport due to its fragility. Barrels of rendered fat were not affected by the shaking of the wagon or temperature changes. The entire camp kitchen smelled of fried beef. Fat was also the only available and reliable preservative for long-term storage of meat without refrigeration. Large pieces of fried pork were tightly packed into clay pots and poured over with hot melted lard. As it cooled, the fat solidified into a hard white plug, completely blocking air access to the product. This layer of fat reliably protected the meat from bacteria, mold, and drying out, acting as an airtight seal. This technology allowed cooked meat to be stored in cool cellars for many months, until summer. It was the only way to keep pork edible without refrigeration or salt. People in the past intuitively and practically understood the critical importance of fat for survival in a harsh climate. Excessive thinness at that time was considered a sure sign of serious illness, weakness, or extreme poverty. A thin person aroused pity and suspicion that he had consumption or worms. On the contrary, being overweight was perceived by society as a clear indicator of high wealth, excellent health, and physical strength. A fat person was someone who ate well and could survive a hungry winter. Beauty standards were dictated by the need for survival. How do you think they managed to preserve food without refrigerators in the hot summer? Salted pork, which everyone simply called solanina, was the undisputed king of the meat diet in those harsh times. This product could be found everywhere, in the holds of warships, in military camp tents, and in the rickety wagons of migrants. It was tough meat, firmly preserved in an incredibly strong salt brine that killed all living things. This radical method of preservation allowed the product to remain unspoiled for months and even years at any positive air temperature. For people of that time, it was a real salvation from hunger, as refrigerators did not yet exist. Pork, saturated with salt to the very core of its fibers, became practically eternal, provided the packaging remained sealed. It was not so much food in our understanding as concentrated energy capable of surviving heat and humidity. The taste took a back seat to the product's ability to be stored without special conditions. Heavy oak barrels filled to the brim with pieces of salted meat were an essential and most valuable cargo for any long expedition. No caravan or lone traveler set out on the dangerous journey to the Wild West without a supply of these barrels. It was a strategic reserve, the loss of which meant certain death from exhaustion in the middle of the prairie. People treasured these barrels more than gold, because gold could not be eaten. Salt in high concentrations reliably killed any putrefactive bacteria and preserved the structure of the meat's muscle fibers. It was the only way available to humans to take animal protein with them on a long journey across the continent. Dried meat could become damp and moldy, but meat in brine was protected by a reliable chemical armor. The technology was simple, ancient, but foolproof. However, before being eaten, these pieces of meat required mandatory and lengthy pretreatment. They had to be soaked for a very long time in pots of fresh water, which had to be changed several times a day. This tedious process was absolutely necessary to remove excess corrosive salt from the product and make it edible. The cook had to be patient to prepare dinner. If this stage was skipped or rushed, the meat was simply physically impossible to eat due to its monstrous causticity and saltiness. It burned the mouth and caused instant rejection by the body accustomed to normal food. Therefore, the preparation of dinner at a stop was planned in advance, soaking the pieces from the evening or early morning. If the supply of fresh water on the way was limited, or there was a catastrophic lack of time for a stop, serious problems began. The long-awaited meal turned into a real ordeal for the body of a tired traveler. They had to eat the meat half-salted, swallowing the pieces almost without chewing. Such salty meat inevitably caused unbearable, agonizing thirst, which was then very difficult to quench with small doses of water. In the hot desert or arid steppe, this could become a deadly factor, leading to rapid dehydration. People were caught in a trap. They needed to eat in order to walk, but the food made them thirsty. The classic and most common culinary combination on the frontier was simple stewed beans with pieces of salted pork. It was the cheapest, most accessible, and incredibly nutritious dish, which became a symbol of the era. Fatty and salty pork gave the bland and tasteless beans the necessary rich flavor and aroma. The beans, in turn, provided the body with the necessary vegetable protein and fiber, creating a feeling of fullness for the whole day. Together, these two ingredients created the ideal calorie balance necessary for hard physical work in the fresh air. It was the food on which America was built, simple and rough like the life of the pioneers themselves. Unfortunately, the quality of the salted meat supplied was often poor and rightly criticized by consumers. Unscrupulous army suppliers and traders could, without compunction, salt old, tough, or even spoiled meat. Salt and spices perfectly masked the smell of decay and the color of stale products. But hungry people on the road or in the trenches usually had no choice, and they could not return the goods to the seller. They ate what was in the barrel, trying to mask the suspicious smell by adding pepper or onions. Soldiers often gave salted meat ironic nicknames, hinting at its ancient age and rock-hard texture. Salted meat itself was a real hard currency on the frontier of civilization, where money often had no value. It could be easily used to pay a farmhand for hard work on the farm or to hire an assistant. People were more willing to accept payment in food which guaranteed survival, than in paper dollars, which could depreciate. Often, during breaks, salted meat was simply fried in a hot pan until it became dry and brittle chips. This was done intentionally to melt as much of the valuable fat out of the pieces as possible for use in other ways, such as for lubrication. The fat was drained off separately, and the dry meat remains were used as an additive. The dry and salty pieces of meat left after rendering were added to liquid soups or porridges for flavor. Sometimes, when in a hurry, they were eaten as they were, with crackers or cornbread if there was no time to light a fire. It was a quick snack that provided salt and energy to continue the journey. For the regular army, salted meat was the main and indispensable strategic food product for centuries. Daily rations of this meat were strictly and precisely regulated by military regulations and controlled by officers. A soldier could forgive poor clothing, but not the absence of meat in the pot. A sudden reduction in meat rations or the distribution of poor quality salted meat could cause a bloody mutiny among soldiers faster than a delay in pay. Commanders knew that without a regular supply of salted meat, the army would simply be physically unable to march and fight effectively. The outcome of entire military campaigns and the fate of states depended on the supply of this simple product. When supplies of flour and meat were running low, the pioneers looked down at their feet. They had to turn to the centuries-old experience of the continent's indigenous peoples. The wilderness, which seemed empty, was actually full of food. You just had to know where to look and how to cook it. Women and children often gathered wild plants around the camp. They looked for wild onions, various berries, and edible roots. This helped to diversify the meager and monotonous diet. Fresh vitamins were necessary for the prevention of many diseases. In Utah, Mormon settlers literally escaped starvation. They were helped by the bulbs of this beautiful flower found on the hillsides. These starchy tubers were dug up and boiled or baked in ashes. They tasted like regular potatoes and were nutritious. In the hot Southwest, mesquite pods were an important source of food. They were collected and ground into a sweet, fragrant flour. This flour was used to bake special flatbreads that did not spoil for a long time. They were rich in protein and natural sugars, providing energy. The fruits of the prickly pear cactus were also used. They were carefully cleaned of small needles and eaten raw. They were also used to make thick jam or syrup. This was a valuable source of moisture in arid regions. Oak acorns were another important but difficult resource. They required lengthy and careful processing before they could be eaten. They were soaked in running water for days to remove the bitter tannins. Only then were they ground into flour for baking bread. Gathering mushrooms and berries was an important seasonal activity for everyone. It allowed them to stock up on dried food for the long winter. However, this required in-depth knowledge of the local flora and caution. A mistake could be fatal due to the presence of poisonous lookalikes. Tea was often brewed from pine or spruce branches. This drink was rich in vitamin C and had a pleasant coniferous aroma. The leaves of a shrub known as Mormon tea were also used. These decoctions strengthened the immunity of people weakened by the difficult journey. The first spring greens were a real treat after winter. Dandelion, quinoa, and amaranth leaves were gathered by the basketful. They were used like spinach, added to soups or stews with fat. This helped the body recover after months of eating only crackers. The ability to see food where others saw weeds saved lives. Many settlers survived only because they learned from the local tribes.
Careful now.
Wild plants not only fed, but also healed people in the wilderness. Nature was the only pharmacy and store available.
Boil the leaves for a poultice. It draws the...
Field cuisine during long cattle drives was truly Spartan, but it was in these harsh conditions that the main culinary legends of the Wild West were born. The undisputed center of the universe for tired cowboy was always the famous chuck wagon, a covered wagon with provisions and utensils. This mobile headquarters was run by a cook, who was often the most respected and influential person in the camp hierarchy, eclipsing even the head of the drive. The mood and physical working capacity of the entire team directly depended on his professional skills and ability to manage scarce resources. This man was the keeper of the hearth in the endless steppe. and it was to his wagon that people gravitated after their shift. The cook got up before everyone else, often long before dawn, to have time to prepare a hot breakfast and brew coffee for the awakening camp. If the food was tasty and hot, the cowboys were willing to forgive any hardships of the journey in bad weather. The stomach ruled the morale of the detachment much more strongly than the promise of a salary. The cook in the camp was usually called simply Cookie, regardless of his real name, age, or origin. He was the rightful king, god, and supreme judge in his small domain on wheels, outlined by the light of the campfire. Arguing with the cook or criticizing his cooking was not only foolish, but also truly dangerous for any daredevil. He could easily ruin the offender's life by accidentally sprinkling sand into their food or giving them the smallest portions of meat. Delicious and hearty food was the only bright joy and entertainment after a hard 18-hour day in the saddle. The whole social life revolved around the cook and his cauldrons, where people learned the news and told stories. Cookie's authority was unquestionable, and even the most rowdy guys became docile when they approached the distribution point with their tin plates. One of the most famous and colorful dishes of that era was a stew with the crude name Son of a Bitch. It got this provocative name not because of its taste, but because of the specific and varied ingredients that went into the recipe. It was made exclusively from fresh calf offal, which was slaughtered right on the road to replenish supplies. Absolutely everything that could be eaten went into a huge communal pot. The heart, liver, kidneys, tongue, and even the animal's brains. The favorite dessert of these tough men was often a dish affectionately called spotted puppy, which was a sweet rice porridge. The rice was cooked in a large pot with raisins and, if the crew was lucky, cane sugar and condensed milk. The dark raisins floating in the thick white porridge reminded the cooks of the spots on a Dalmatian puppy's coat, hence the name. This simple and unpretentious dish seemed to the inhabitants of the prairie to be the height of culinary art and tenderness. Bread and the famous biscuits were baked in heavy cast-iron Dutch ovens, equipped with tight-fitting lids with sides. These massive pots were buried directly in the hot coals of the fire, and a layer of heat and ash was also poured on top of the lid. This created an oven effect, where the heat was evenly distributed on all sides, baking the dough. The ability to bake fluffy and golden biscuits without a thermometer or timer was a real art, not available to everyone. The cook had to intuitively feel the temperature of the coals and the time, taking into account the wind and humidity. If the biscuits did not burn on the bottom and were soft on the inside, it was considered a sign of the highest skill for any camping cook. Good bread was the cook's calling card and a source of professional pride. The daily menu was rather monotonous, but very filling and incredibly high in calories. The diet consisted mainly of red beans, various types of meat, cornbread, strong coffee, and sometimes dried fruit. Such a diet was necessary to compensate for the enormous energy losses of the horsemen during the day. The body needed fuel, and taste took a back seat to nutrition. Complaining about the monotony or quality of food was strictly unacceptable among real prairie men. Anyone who broke this unspoken rule of tranquility risked being left without dinner the next time by the offended cook. Everyone ate in silence, expressing their gratitude with empty plates because the alternative was hunger. The chuck wagon was at once a home, a men's club, and an open-air dining room. It was the only place where scattered people gathered together around a live fire, becoming a team. Here, in the circle of light, they felt safe from the darkness of night and predators. The cowboys' dishes were exclusively tin or iron so that they would not shatter on the long journey over rough terrain. They always rattled loudly in a special box as the wagon moved over bumps and potholes. This specific metallic sound was the best music to the ears of hungry drivers traveling in the distance. It meant that the camp was close, the wagon had stopped, and the long-awaited hot dinner would soon be ready. The sound of clattering dishes was a signal that the workday was over and a promise of a short rest. For a cowboy, there was nothing sweeter than this ringing sound, heralding peace and satiety. The Great Depression of the 1930s revived forgotten frontier skills. People once again had to search for food in city garbage dumps. The famous hobo stew became a symbol of these difficult times. It was cooked in large homeless camps, which were called jungles. The principle of cooking this dish was extremely simple and democratic. Each participant put whatever they had found during the day into a common pot. Some brought a single potato or a limp carrot. Others donated a piece of meat or just a meat bone for broth. It was a collective creation based on complete improvisation. The taste of the dish depended entirely on luck and people's generosity. This stew was cooked for hours over a slow fire. The ingredients had to be boiled down and infuse the broth with their flavors. Often, vegetables that farmers discarded as substandard were used. People picked them up in fields or in the backyards of markets. They also used scraps from butcher shops that used to be fed to dogs. Pride gave way to the need to feed empty stomachs. Free soup kitchens were hugely popular in cities. There, thin soup and a piece of bread were distributed to all those in need. The queues for this food stretched for entire city blocks. These queues became a visual symbol of the country's economic disaster. People even learned to cook roll-in-the-field soup. The young green shoots of this weed were boiled until completely soft. It was a bitter and unnutritious dish, but it was hot. It filled the stomach somehow and dulled the feeling of hunger. To increase the volume of bread, bakers resorted to tricks. They sometimes added sawdust or other fillers to the dough. This made the loaf heavier and created the illusion of fullness after eating. Such food was of little benefit, but it was cheap. Hunting small game once again became a means of survival for families. They caught rabbits, squirrels, and even armadillos and opossums. This game was ironically called Hoover Chicken in honor of the president. He was blamed for the crisis, and humor was a way of defending themselves. Mutual aid became the main condition for survival in those years. People shared their last piece of bread with their neighbors without hesitation. Misfortune united them, erasing the social boundaries between yesterday's rich and poor. It was reminiscent of the days of the first settlers and their solidarity. These dishes are a monument to human resilience in the face of despair. They remind us that even when the economy collapses, people still want to live. Hope and hot soup can save lives in any situation. History is cyclical, and the skills of our ancestors may come in handy again. The history of the American frontier and the Great Depression is not just a story of battles. It is a chronicle of the incredible, sometimes shocking culinary ingenuity of ordinary people. On the brink of survival, they prove the indestructibility of the human spirit. As long as there is even the slightest hope of finding food, people will fight to the end. From pemmican, which could be stored for decades in leather bags, to tramp stew made from random scraps. Each of these dishes became a building block in the foundation of the nation. These recipes, born out of the agony of hunger, teach us to appreciate the simple things. We understand that comfort and a full refrigerator are not a given, but a privilege. The ability to adapt to any conditions remains the main survival skill. The ability to find resources where there are none is important in any era. Our world is fragile, and the experience of our ancestors can be more valuable than gold. The history of food is the history of life itself, in its harshest manifestations. Which of these extreme dishes would you dare to try for the sake of a historical experiment? And what would you not touch even if you were starving? Be sure to subscribe to the channel, because there are many more amazing discoveries ahead of us.